Hi, Tony here again from all the remote things. And this week I've got a cracker of a guest. I've got Caitlin Walker. Now, I'm so happy to have you on here, Caitlin. How are you today?
I'm really good. Although I'm looking outside, we've been talking about water and I'm thinking, oh, there's a high tide there. So as soon as we're finished, I'm going to nip out for a little swim.
Oh, lovely. We've been sharing notes backwards and forwards. I live on an island, you live near an estuary. It's been fun talking off air. Um, Let me talk about how I got interested and got you on the cast. Caitlin is involved in what we would say is clean language. And I really, really am impressed with how that works and what it brings to the table in terms of lots of different arenas. Caitlin, can you introduce yourself and talk just a tad to that for us?
hmm So clean language is it's an interesting thing because a lot of what clean language is what it isn't. It might be worth. I'll give you a little bit of background. So it was developed by a guy called David Grove. He's a New Zealander. He was a New Zealander. He's not with us anymore. And he became really interested in not my bag, but in psychotherapy. And he looked at people who were working with clients, with therapy clients. And he said, if you take all the questions that they ask and you look at the structure of them, you can see how the therapist shapes the client's thinking. He said, what if we pared our language down to its absolute minimum so that we didn't impose the structure of our thinking on their thinking, and we could really find out how they're organizing their experience. So, great idea. It wasn't, I mean, I was interested, but it wasn't a big thing for me. But I went to see him work, and he was working with a client, and he was saying to them things like, so what would you like to have happen? Oh, I'd like to find my voice. Oh, what kind of find? Oh, it's like it keeps getting lost. But it keeps getting lost. Where does it keep getting lost? And he was asking really simple questions like what kind of, where, is there anything else about? And as he did it, the client built this sort of landscape around themselves of their experience, of their trauma. And then once the landscape was developed, it started to update itself. They got this huge release from their trauma. That was the end of the show. And I was like, whoa, that was really good. But that wasn't what got me interested. It was a little exercise, which is how I'll introduce it. He said, okay, now go away in pairs and ask 4 questions. Ask your partner, what would you like to have happen? And whatever they say, choose a word and ask, what kind of? Then ask, where? And then ask, is there anything else? So that's it. That's an exercise anyone in the world could do. And we went away. Some bloke in a suit. Remember, I was young and cool then, and everyone else was sort of over 40s, businessy sort of people in suits. And this guy comes over, and I thought, oh dear, what a shame. He's really boring. And he said to me, so Caitlin, what would you like to have happen? At the time, I was involved in artificial intelligence in computing. I was doing a PhD in teaching computers how to understand human speech. I was a bit miserable, but he said, what would you like to have happen? And I went, I'd like to find my path. And he said, what kind of path is that path? And I was like, well, it would be compelling. And he said, and where is the path? And I went, oh, it's that way. And he said, is there anything else about that path? And I went, I'm not on it. And that was the end of the exercise. And I stood there in that hotel when everyone else went home, and I went, okay, that's the path I'm on. And that's the path I should be on. What am I going to do now? And so I walked out of my PhD, my partner of 12 years, my everything. And then I went on this path, which had nothing to do with computing, which had everything to do with people. And it was a very strange little moment. It was like, oh, okay. When somebody asks you questions where they have no outcome, it leaves your system free to pay attention to data instead of to the relationship with them. And so that's how I got hooked in. So that's in the simplest form. So clean questions are questions that don't impose structure externally. And the reason I got into it was it literally changed my life.
I've had some intros, but that's the most interesting intro I've had for a while about how you actually got into what you're doing. So I guess talking to it, we want to dig in a bit deeper, right? And the thing that got me is how you're using it. So I understand the mechanism and what it is, but it's the way that you're applying it that interests me. So I've seen some of the work that you've done with Clean for Teams, etc. Talk a little bit about how you're using it and experiences for me, Alan.
Yeah. So the really clean language is really simple. There's about 10 questions. You just learn them, ask them. That's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is what it does to your attention. Because if I'm going to ask you a clean question in a team, so in a team, I don't know, somebody says, well, I think we're going off the rails here. And somebody else will say, no, we're absolutely fine because X, Y, and Z. And I'll say, let's just pause a second. Because when he said, we're going off the rails, and she says, no, we're fine, neither of them have the same internal model. So when he says we're going off the rails, if she just says, so what have you seen and heard that lets you know we're going off the rails? Or whereabouts are the rails? Or what kind of, if we were on the rails, what would we be doing? If you asked a clean-ish question about their statement first, before you then said, oh, this is how it is from my perspective, you actually bring the invisible architecture in Teams up to light a bit. So you're actually dealing meaningfully with one another. And so the big application for me for Clean was it's two things. It's dropping out the misunderstanding that goes on because people have assumed things that are incorrect about what other people are saying, and the increase of awareness of the invisible structures that we carry with us when we're into the level of detail we need, whether I look to the future, I look to the present, all of those little details, we can find those out with a clean question or two. So Clean for Teams, first of all, is me doing it. I can go in and help teams become much better functioning. But the real joy is, can I teach a team to self-model? So systemic modeling is where the team knows just enough of this work that they can agilely think in the moment and go, hang on a minute, I'm making an assumption. I'm just going to ask one question. So it's, can a team do this for themselves?
It's interesting you use the word agile, and obviously a lot of the teams you'll deal with have been working in the agile frame. And I think we were talking a little bit off air about the fact that you can use it in retrospectives, you can use it in the cadences and stand-ups that a lot of agile teams tend to apply. I'd love to hear how that's changed the frame of reference in those things.
Mm-hmm. I think the thing to look at with both of these is, when are we unclean? When are we not agile? When do we have a fixed instead of a growth mindset? All of those, these are all human conditions. We love prejudice. We love drama. We love getting into contempt because it's easy, because it's comfortable, because we have tracks or fixed ways of being. So what Clean does is it prevents you from doing that. So, for example, if I'm in a retrospective and I'm always already a little bit irritated or I'm a bit ashamed of what's gone on, then the way I contribute, the way I listen will become tainted. It'll become fixed on a drama or contemptuous narrative. If I'm only allowed, or we have a culture here where we ask clean things, we separate evidence from inference, we have a series of clean models that we apply, it interrupts our fixed thinking, our contemptuous thinking, and it just keeps us balanced, present to what is rather than what we made up, present to what is rather than what we wish had happened. So just more present. And from there we can go, okay, what's the data? What do we want to have happen? What are we going to do? So it does things like, it takes away the shame. So if you're feeling shame, you can just own it. You can say, do you know what, I'm feeling like a victim here. And your group, if they're clean trained, should then say, what have you seen and heard? What's happened just before? It's a bit like what? They'll unpack it and then look at systemically, what can we do so we're not blocking energy, but we're going back towards our outcome again. So yeah, it's to do with what it's not. It's about keeping us present to what is, and moving evidence-based, paying attention to data, and then moving forward. Which I think anyone in the agile space, it's the thinking that goes underneath agile thinking.
Yes, yeah, I can see that, and I can hear that in what you're saying. Well, the true essence of what agile really should be, if we pare it back. Interestingly enough, in the last 3 years, obviously, we don't need to. The pandemic's obviously induced pressures, but with the general workforce moving into these remote and hybrid frames, I'm interested to understand how this has helped, or how you've worked with teams in terms of that, because I'm sure that would have changed reference points for the work that you were doing as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So certainly when we started this work, I'm always looking for patterns, because patterns in the dynamic, I don't know, in my thinking, but then between us, between teams, in organizations, you can see it in the physicality of the workplace.
Yeah.
If in this organization, this group has a beautiful coffee machine, and these guys, put 10 pence in and get something horrible out of a big machine, that's significant. There are meta messages all through an organization when they meet up. And so I think that one of the things when we all went remote is it gave us a chance to change, to become, it's a new, fresh start. And I know it's difficult for me to say, because I tend to, Tony, tend to get brought in when there's problems. People don't usually pay me to come in and say, hey, we've got a brilliant organization. Can you come and hang out and tell us how great we are? But the bit I've heard about when it's working best before we've come in, people have gone into that space with fresh eyes and said, what's important to us as humans? And then gone, how do we make sure we have those important things remotely? How do we have time to check in with each other, to download? And some organizations have gone too far. It's like they never get anything done. They're so busy checking in, and it's like, actually, this is not okay with me.
Great, yeah.
And we're all forced to do it now. Whereas when we were not remote, you could do that. Those people who wanted to could do that check-in by the water cooler or whatever, and you didn't all have to get involved. Whereas now, I know it's way too much for some people, and others, they're not doing it at all. It's so functional. It's burning people out because they're having to work in a very, very functional team. So I think that what Clean can do is it can ask the question of a group. For this team to be working at its best remotely, that would be like, what? What do you need? What does she need? What does he need? What do I need? What's the least we have to do to really take care of each other? And how do we differentiate that? So those of us who need more of this can take it here. So it's about really making sure that what we do is fit for purpose. And I think the remote working has given us a chance to reevaluate that.
Yeah, I agree. And obviously, the remote agility framework is one of my passions and baby, as you know, and that's part of our focus, is that reevaluation of it and the art of async work, right? So there's people think asynchronous is just throw it out there and then they'll read it, or we'll have these meetings, but there's an art of the async, and what's required to get you where you need to go, with still allowing you then using that time to enable the ability to have those water cooler conversations, to have those sharper conversations. And I see clean languages is something that plays into that as well. The question I want to ask you there is, there's another dynamic now. So we went into remote and that was everybody in. Now we've got, some have stayed and seen that, that's fantastic, but some have got a foot in either camp. So, people are calling it hybrid. I really dislike that term, and I'm on record on this cast many times saying, if you've got somebody in the office and you've got somebody who's on screen, then you're all remote. But apart from that, there are different dynamics because you do have that. How do you see that playing into with the work that you're doing, or what are you seeing?
I think that one of the things that it comes back to me in my work is there's actually a level of complexity to this that I think a lot of people were unprepared for. So one of the things that's happened, I think, is that as we had to reevaluate, people are becoming able to advocate for their needs. We are in a time where for some people there's an awful lot more attention on their rights rather than their responsibilities. So there's a lot of I need this and I need that, as opposed to what we'd be looking for with systemic modeling is, okay, these are your needs and that's his needs and that's her needs and that's their needs. How are we going to organize this? And so for some people, they're very demanding and very angry with people when they don't get their needs met. There's the whole neurodiversity thing, which has always been my bread and butter, because I love to work with programmers, lots of whom are neurodiverse. When you're remote working, and some of you can only manage this much detail, some of you need a lot of time on your own, like you've got to be able to manage all of those things as well. So what I think at the moment is it's thrown up a level of complexity. And I think that will settle again, where you need to find strategies and norms, hopefully this time around, because we don't have the same top-down punitive, I'm the boss, you all have to do what I say thing. We have more of a shared responsibility or shared governance. And that brings with it complexity. But I think that over the next 5 years, we'll start to develop some strategies, some norms for how we ask for what we want, how we check in that the group gets what it needs, without this big, oh my goodness, let's have a half-hour check-in and a 10-minute meeting.
So I have a thing that I see now, and it's a phrase, organizational trauma. And why I bring that to the table is because organizational trauma to me is what's happened is because of everybody moving into these new dynamics. And as you said, some are doing okay. So this is not like painting with the same brush, but there is a large quotient who've gone so far to the right. And you're right, they're meetinged out, they're burned out, they're zoomed out, they have every kind of monitoring you could possibly think of. And that's actually creating, it's organizational trauma for people. And as you said, as we start to come to the right and we start to level out, this is where we're going to have to help people in the way they work and bring it to a place where everybody can work in a great way. And I see clean language helping with that. So I was really keen to get you on and talk to you about that.
Well, I think what clean language does, particularly, clean language is just a thing. It's just that literally means asking questions that don't have structure in them. There's lots of stuff on top of that. There's a clean stance, which means that you notice when you're in contempt, when you're not. You notice when you're being dirty, when you're not. You notice when you've made assumptions. And then there's systemic modeling, which is where you're going, okay, we want X to happen. What do we need to do? We need to find out what people want. We find out what's not working, what is working. It's like, what's the least we all need to do as a group if we want to create something new that suits the majority of us? It might not suit everybody, but the majority of us. In some ways, it's not. If you think back, when I very first started this work, we were just going between that age where, if you were at school and you did something wrong, even if you didn't do something wrong, if your teacher felt like you might have done something wrong, you could get beaten with a cane. So when I was, I'm left-handed, but I write with my right hand because I would get my left hand. I wasn't allowed. It would be tied behind my back. So we went from that way of schooling. And then when I first started going and working with this work in schools, we had things where I would walk down a corridor and a pupil would be hitting a teacher, and the teacher would be having their hands by their sides because they would be worried about intervening in case they were accused of assault. And it was like we went from here, and they're trying to be something different, but they haven't learned the rules yet. And it was really traumatic. It was a really traumatic time at schools. It was a traumatic time to be a teacher. And I think we're there now as well. But now, as you say, in organizational stuff, it's like, okay, I do think clean can help. I think agility can help, because what we're saying is this is a new landscape. We need to model it. We need to create shared structures, mental, social structures for how we behave around here. And we can do that. So if you say, if this team was just the way you'd like it to be, it will be like what? We'll be like, what are you going to do for me? What do I need to do for you? What are your rights? What are my responsibilities? Those those conversations don't have to be painful. We call it like a rough guide to Tony. You know, I should be able to see it on an A4. When he's at his best, he's a bit like this. When he's at his worst, he's a bit like this. Stuff to support him, stuff that makes him worse, how he likes to make decisions. You know, like a rough guide to. And the metaphors that you get with clean language really help with that because they're sticky. They're easy for me to remember. You know, rather than, I don't know, like a Belbin team model, I can go, or team role, I'm like, I have to remember letters. But if you know that when I'm working at my best, I'm in a mosh pit. There's people stage diving, flying around. It's calm, it's wonderful, and the rapport is amazing. You know, I'm not probably the person to give your admin to. Yeah. I'm great in a crisis. I'm brilliant at thinking when there's huge levels of complexity. I love that. But don't give me something that's mundane and repetitive. I can't do it. Yeah, so metaphors are really sticky like that.
So that's an interesting thing. So let's build on that a tad, because there was something else that piqued my interest, was the concept of embodied metaphors, and talk to me a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, I'm thinking about some stuff that we've just done recently. I've just come back from Geneva. So embodied, I mean, all metaphors are embodied, really. You know, if you watch people talk, if I say to you, you know, when I'm working at my best, I'm in a mosh pit and there's things flying and there's bodies, you can see immediately I'm in the mosh pit. It's behind and in front of me. So in terms of embodiedness, it's all around me. If I was to say to you, as somebody did last week, so when I'm working at my best, I can see what there is to be done and I'm sorting it. It's like a complex, it's like doing 3 jigsaw puzzles at once. So that's them working at their best. You're listening for the 3. So 3 jigsaw puzzles, not 5, not 1, not 20, 3. And what we found out, because we've worked along with occupational psychologists with this work too, is when we've looked at things like processing speed, working memory, ADHD traits, needing for hyperfocus, all of those things, what we find is these embodied metaphors give you a beautiful window into your neurology and your processing structure. So if this person likes 3 jigsaws at once, there's something about that level of complexity that you can then say how many pieces are in each jigsaw. Oh, well, I like to have, you know, 150, 1,000, and about 200. And you're like, oh, that wasn't nearly as complicated as it was in my mind when they first said that. So I bring it down a bit. So the embodied is that they're using their bodies, their eyes, but for metaphoric things rather than, it shows you the way that they want to process information. And that's why the embodiedness is so important, because especially particularly when we're working remotely, we don't pick up the cues. Yeah. I don't see your body. I don't see your feet tapping because you need to get out of the room now, because you need to move. So the metaphors show us, you know, we are just animals trying to get stuff done. So yeah, it demonstrates how we organize the stuff internally.
So just following on from that, you know, we were talking before we came on air as well, and clean can be used in a lot of different environments. But you were also talking about a technique called clean interviewing, which I'm really interested to dig a little deeper in, because it really piqued my interest as well. You did a lot of piquing of my interest, by the way.
No, of course, if we had, you know, when your interest is piqued, you can say whereabouts is the peak of that interest.
It's right up here.
Lovely. I mean, also that's the lovely thing about clean as well, is how there's often the ambiguity of words is often embodied too. You know, I'm not going to do that. What can I not? Well, it's really tight. You know, you get that. Yeah, clean interviewing. So clean interviewing is, I first came across clean interviewing when I was asked to take this stuff into business, because I started with teenagers. outside of the school system and using the clean to help them model their own structure. And then because I just wanted to see if they just modeled what would happen. And what happens is that they would start to self-correct their tempers, their reading ability, their spelling ability, and they started to become a self-learning system. But that was definitely clean modeling. It's quite embodied, and it's a little bit weird. So I might not just go straight into a business and do that. Whereas then the police had said, somebody was in the police who'd come on a training I'd done. She said, oh, we need to teach police to interview vulnerable witnesses and to demonstrate when they're in their interviewing that they haven't led them at all, so that it doesn't get thrown out of court. I was like, oh yeah, easily do that. So we spent 2 years developing and training the police at the Sheffield Police Training Centre to interview particularly children and vulnerable witnesses so that they were absolutely clear. But when we looked at that, we were like, hang on a minute. When we go into business and we say we'd like this project to be like what? When we do clean scoping before a big piece of change work, that's clean interviewing. And when we get into a team and we say, or a retrospective, and you say, okay, this is the last 4 weeks have been like what? And somebody answers and you want to delve into it, not to change it, not to coach them, but just to really understand what they've said, that's clean interviewing. We're like, oh, okay, there's different kinds. So you can interview, I could get my midwife to interview me for how I wanted her to behave during my childbirth. That was a clean interview. I can interview if I'm going to have a builder come and do building work in my house. I can say, we can have if this project that we're going to do together was just the way I'd like it, it'll be like this. For the way you'd like it, it'll be like that. How are you going to show up? How am I going to show up? What do you need from me? What do I need from you? These are interviews. So it's a very simple way of just checking that you're gathering information that's useful without altering the bias. You can put down without biasing what they say. You can say what you want, you can find out what they want, and then you take that clean data and say, now what are we going to do about it if they don't match?
So that seems to have applications, not just, so you obviously work with software development teams and etc., but you're also talking about business as a greater system of work as well. But from listening to you, you were saying to me that you can use this with midwifery, or you can use this for. So, what are some of the other examples of how this can be used and applied?
Yeah, and so I still work now with teenagers who have emotional-based school avoidance. So I work with schools and kids, and that's huge right now because we've got lots of children who stopped going to school and now won't go back.
Mm.
And there's lots of reasons for that. School is a horrific place for lots of people. So you can use it to model small areas to find out what's going on for them. Look at the structure of how the school is dealing with that and look at ways that's mismatching, and then come back in and then give, okay, this is what we're seeing and hearing. Here's the models for it. And then you can create policy that'll be a more effective policy for getting children, out of the bedrooms and back into society. So that's a big area that we use it in. Sarah Backer and I are going to do a thing in America where we're looking with therapists. We're looking at embodied trauma. So there we're looking at how does the body remember things that have happened? And what you're talking about earlier, this that in some ways that there's been organizational trauma.
Yeah.
What we're finding the other way is that going to work is actually traumatizing some people physiologically. So Sarah and I are looking at how do we look at the way that their bodies are remembering information, model it. And there's a key philosophy here, which is that if you have data and you model it, you've got a model for how it relates to itself, you can make better decisions. And I was thinking about this as well. So, and you can do that in anything. So childbirth, I mentioned. I know a few people who use this with working between medical and birthing mothers, medical people and birthing mothers, and going, how are we going to bring these two worlds together? So that you can use it virtually anywhere, it's a mindset, but you've got to know, what are we going to do with it and what's the philosophy? So you fundamentally have to trust that people can make decent decisions. So I was thinking, where could you not use it? Don't use it if you think the people you're working with are idiots. Don't consult people if you don't trust them to actually make real decisions. I'm thinking you must have this in the agile world as well. You cannot be agile if you fundamentally don't trust your workforce.
Yeah, it's something that
Your managers.
It's something that we talk about a lot, particularly with the remote agility framework, and we have the concept of what we call remote governance, and that means governing the system of work, not that PMO and project. That's part of it, but in that we've developed the pillars of remote governance. And one of those is basically transparency and intent-based leadership. Now, both of those rely on trust.
Mm-hmm.
That's being able to push the decisioning down to the people and allow them to make that decisioning without having to be intervening all the time, and the right guide rail. And so when you're talking about this, I can see it flowing backwards and forwards.
So what you might have to have with something like that, if you were trying to get people who hadn't worked like that to work like that, you might look at some of the underpinning needs, such as, for you to trust somebody, for you, trust is like what? And then you need to find out. So Caitlin, for you to trust somebody, to really trust them to make their own decisions, trust for you is like what? What would you need to have seen and heard? What would allow you to believe that that person was trustworthy? Because if you have to trust and you don't know what you need to trust yet, everyone's working, they're trying to work on this agile framework, but they're all working a bit blind. So there is, I'm thinking, what's the underpinning stuff? This is a clean language, and self-modeling and clean for teams is about developing the emotional awareness and intelligence a team needs to take on these new structures. It's that you need this before that.
Yeah, and you hear that bandied around a lot, emotional intelligence and those sorts of things. But when you actually ask the right questions against it, they don't really know what they're talking about. And you go, okay, well, you're starting to say that's a very dangerous thing, actually, because what you can do, and I hear this a lot with, I shouldn't use the word young, but new coaches or coaches who've come to starting to do this agile thing, and they're stepping into this saying, emotional intelligence, and the reality is there's certain spaces that we shouldn't step into, and you should know when not to step into those, but you need to be able to ask the right questions to understand that.
Yeah. And I'd like, while we're just talking about people making mistakes with this stuff, if you want to go and take any of these clean questions and go and have a go with them, we'd say don't ever ask more than 2 or 3 questions in a go and then become normal, talk a normal conversation again, because they're powerful old tools. And I was doing a startup years ago, and I said, if this startup was going just the way you'd like it to, the startup would be like what? And the leader said, I'd like it to be safe. I said, what kind of safe? He said, well defended. I said, all right, when it's well defended. Anything else when it's well defended like that? He said, well, it'd be somewhere that we can, we can hide behind. I was, when you can hide behind, what kind of hide? He said, well, like sandbags that we can hide behind. And what kind of this is where I feel safe again. And what kind of an eye is that eye? He said, well, it's a bit like when he's in his stuff now. Tony, I had no right in front of a group of people to keep going and keep going and keep going into what we're getting now is his younger trauma stuff of why safety is so important to him.
Yep.
Because he's experienced, it turns out, bullying at boarding school and the need for social safety. So I would say to anyone listening, ask a couple of questions a couple of times, try them out. But if you want to get good at this, get some training. There's plenty of really low-cost online training. If you're lucky, you can do live online training as well. There's stuff around, but yeah, 2 or 3 questions so that you don't go blundering into people's emotional stuff.
Yeah, and so you do see it, and you do not understand how you can trigger. I call it organizational trauma, but if you push the buttons on that hard, it could end up worse than that. So it's something that that I'm very passionate about, and I think that when I was watching the Clean Language clips that you've done, that came through to me strongly. That here's a mechanism, here's a way that you can understand how to affect, but you can also understand when not to affect. And I think that's a very powerful thing, Caitlin, that you've developed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about, you are responsible for knowing, what did you ask this question for?
Yeah.
You don't just throw them out there unless you're in a practice group and you're really practicing. We have free online practice. We have a thing called Clean Campus. It's a thing called Circles. I can send you the link. But we have free practice areas where you can go and safely practice with somebody who really knows what they're doing, twice a week at different times for the Australians and for the Americans. But yeah, I would go practice. But if you're not practicing, 2 or 3 questions and know, why are you doing this? I think that's always just really important.
Yeah, and I think that practice is important because I take that from my own experience of making some mistakes. Because when you ask the question, be careful what you ask, because the response you get back, you might not know how to deal with it. And that's the practice: is what are these questions going to elicit, and how are you going to respond to what you get back? Because if you apply the wrong response to it, you can create some damage. You can create responses that you really might not want to see.
Yeah, and the big thing about that, again, is also be careful not to misinterpret. So, years ago, I said, it was a little practice group, and we said, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? That was the question somebody had wanted to ask. And this person said, I'd kill myself. And the next person, because it was a practice group and they were just asking the question on their card, they said, what kind of kill yourself? They said, I'd lay down in the dirt and die. And the next person said, and is there anything else when you'd kill yourself like that? And they said, well, I'd just rot into the earth. And the next person said, whereabouts? And they said, well, just deep into the earth. And the next person's card said, and then what happens when you're deep in the earth? And they said, I can breathe again, it's renewal. And the next person said, and what happens next when and they just followed the exercise and it was fine. It was metaphorical. Now, and I did say to them afterwards, I was like, whoa, how come you didn't go respond? Because that wasn't an expected question. She said, you told me I needed to be clean and not to assume that I knew what the person meant. So she said, I just kept going. Now, and it's a funny thing to be saying as a warning. So there's 2 things. One is, when that person said they'd kill themselves, it didn't mean what that might normally mean for other people. What they meant is that the world as they knew it would die and there could be regrowth, is what they actually meant. But if you don't want to go there, then just go, oh, great, thanks for letting me know, and talk about something else. So it doesn't mean you have to go, oh, that sounds really awful, so don't give an unclean response. Just, if you don't like the answer that you've got, if you're not sure about it, just go, thank them for that answer, go talk about something else. But please don't put your fear into whatever their answer was, because it might not be necessary.
That's great advice. Look, we're very close to the end of our time, and I've really, really enjoyed this talk with you. And if anybody else who's listening to this is really interested in this, how can they get in touch? How can they get involved with this Clean Language and what you do, Caitlin?
Well, the big thing would be, it depends what you'd like to do with it. So if you go to cleanlearning.co.uk, there's a whole range of, courses. We're going to do Living with Your End in Mind, Exploring Our Own Deaths in January, which is a fantastic program that I do every year that I love. So yeah, cleanlearning.co.uk will give you the courses that we're running. Cleanlanguage.co.uk is a beautiful repository of the research that's been done, the articles that have been written. That's Penny Tompkins and James Lawley, who modeled David Grove. That's a brilliant resource. And you can also just Google it. There is a lot now of stuff you can watch for free. If you like Clean for Teens, there's a Udemy course. If you put a Udemy online training course, it's only about $20. It's a really thorough 2-day training in clean language and systemic modeling. So there's lots of different places you can go to.
Brilliant. We'll stick those in the show notes, those things that you've mentioned as well. Look, it's been fantastic to have you on all the remote things today. If you're watching this, please like, subscribe so we can keep this thing going. Join our Remote AF community. Just head to remoteaf.co, click the community button. You'll find us on Circle. It's a fantastic community of like-minded people talking about things like this and how we work in remote and hybrid. It's been fantastic having you on all the remote things today, Caitlin. Thank you so much.
I'm really enjoying it. Good. See you again.
Pleasure.